My name is Mara Whitaker, and I was 38 years old the night my mother called me a failure in front of my father's boss. It happened at the Hawthorne Grand in Grand Rapids, under chandeliers Elaine Whitaker had chosen herself because, as she told the florist, a man's retirement should look respectable. My father, Silas, had given 38 years to Northstar Medical Supply Depot, and my mother had turned that fact into a production. There were navy tablecloths, white roses, a slideshow of Dad in work boots and safety glasses, and a banner over the small stage that read, 38 years of service. 96 people came, men who had worked beside him on concrete floors, supervisors in dark suits, women from my mother's church who knew exactly which daughter Elaine liked to talk about and which one she lowered her voice for. My sister Jocelyn sat near the front with her husband, smiling like she had been born at the correct table. I was seated near the kitchen doors. I did not complain. I had driven 3 hours to be there. I wore my gray coat, the good one, and smiled at the registration table like a daughter, not like the woman whose company processed payroll for half the people in that room. Then Reed Fallon walked in. My mother saw him before she saw anything else. Coup of Northstar. Important. Useful. The kind of man Elaine believed families should impress. She took Jocelyn by the elbow first, then placed her hand on my shoulder and steered us across the ballroom. "This is Mara," she said, with that soft little sigh she had perfected over the years. "Sweet girl, but she never really became anything. I think she does payroll paperwork now." A few people laughed. Reed looked at my mother, then at me. He set his glass down carefully. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "your daughter signs every paycheck in this room, including mine. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 32% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right." All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. Before that room went silent, before Reed Fallon set down his glass and gave my mother the kind of correction a woman like Elaine Whitaker could not survive gracefully, there had been 14 years of smaller rooms where no one corrected her at all. That was how my mother worked. She did not destroy you in one dramatic speech. She reduced you by inches, politely, in kitchens and church basements and birthday dinners, until people believed the smaller version of you had always been true. At 24, I left nursing school with 1 semester unfinished. In my family, that became the whole story. Not that I had worked double shifts while studying. Not that I had discovered, almost by accident, that I understood billing systems and payroll errors better than most people who had been doing it for years. Not that I was the person coworkers came to when a check was short, a deduction looked wrong, or an insurance code had tangled itself into someone's rent money. None of that mattered because it did not sound impressive when my mother said it over coffee after Sunday service. A daughter in nursing sounded respectable. A daughter working nights in a medical billing office sounded like something Elaine had to explain, and Elaine hated explaining anything that did not flatter her. My father saw it differently, but not better. Silas Whitaker believed a person proved their worth by staying put. Same company, same lunchbox, same route to work, same hands doing the same useful thing until retirement. To him, leaving school meant I had failed to finish. It did not matter that I was moving toward something. He only saw what I had walked away from. Jocelyn never had to fight that kind of judgment. My older sister's life came arranged in the language my mother loved. Degree, marriage, children, school administration, family Christmas cards where everyone wore cream and navy. Elaine could say vice principal and watch people nod with immediate understanding. Jocelyn's life required no translation. Mine always came after a pause. People would ask, "And Mara?" My mother would smile softly, the way women smile when they are about to ask for pity without using the word. "Mara is doing some office payroll thing," she would say. "She's always taken a little longer to find herself." For a while, I tried to answer for myself. I tried to explain that payroll was not just numbers on a screen. It was groceries, rent, medication, gas in someone's car before a Monday shift. But my mother had already moved on by then. usually to Jocelyn's children or a fundraiser at church. Eventually, I stopped explaining. Not because she was right, because I finally understood she was not listening. The night I stopped asking them to believe me began with a yellow legal pad on my parents' kitchen table. It was a Thursday in February, cold enough that the windows fogged around the edges while baked chicken cooled on the stove. My father sat in his usual chair, with the household bills stacked beside his elbow and his reading glasses low on his nose. My mother stood at the sink rinsing a plate that was already clean. On the refrigerator, Jocelyn's photo from a school newsletter was still taped at eye level, her name printed neatly beneath it, as if the house itself needed a reminder of which daughter made sense. I had spent 3 weeks building that plan, not imagining it, building it. Payroll software, compliance certification, business registration, liability insurance, a used desk from an office supply store that was closing. 3 months of rent for a small back room behind a tax preparer on Fulton Street. The total came to $11,500. I was not asking my parents to give me the money. I was asking my father to co-sign a small business loan because the bank wanted credit history, and at 24, I did not have enough of it yet, but I had proof the idea could work. 2 clinics had agreed to let me audit their payroll records. A dental office owner said she would switch to me if I could fix her overtime mess before March. I had names, margins, deadlines, follow-up calls, and a repayment schedule written so clearly I thought even my father would have to respect it. He read the first page, then the second, slowly, carefully, the way a man reads something he plans to reject with dignity. He did not ask about the clinics. He did not ask how I found them. He did not ask why I believed a 12-employee dental office mattered enough to keep me awake after night shifts. He only picked up his pen and wrote 4 words across the bottom of the last page. Finish something first. Then, he slid it back to me. My mother did not turn from the sink. She always quits when things get hard, she said, like she was naming the weather. No one yelled. That was the part that stayed with me. A loud cruelty gives you something to push against. Quiet certainty just settles over the room and waits for you to breathe it in. I looked at my father's handwriting cutting across 3 weeks of work, and something inside me went still. I folded the yellow pages once. Then again, I put them in my purse. Not because I wanted to remember the insult. Because I never wanted to forget how dangerous it was to ask the wrong people for permission to become myself. After that night, I stopped bringing plans home. I did not make an announcement. I did not slam a door or promise anyone I would prove them wrong. I simply learned that certain rooms were not built for my hope. So I kept my work where it could breathe, in borrowed offices, after hours, phone calls, spreadsheets with coffee rings on the corners, and conversations with people who cared whether the numbers added up. My mother, however, kept doing what she had always done. Elaine Whitaker had a talent for making control look like concern. She never said she was ashamed of me. That would have been too plain, too easy to answer. Instead, she softened me in public until I became harmless. At church luncheons, when someone asked what I was doing, she would touch my wrist before I could speak and say, "Mara is still in healthcare administration, sort of." At family birthdays, she would smile and add, "She works behind the scenes, very behind the scenes." People nodded because Elaine had given them the shape of an answer without any truth inside it. The worst part was how gentle it sounded. My mother could pass rolls, refill coffee, remember a neighbor's surgery date, and reduce me in the same pleasant voice she used to praise a casserole. No one called it cruel, because she never raised her voice. She just placed one careful hand on the conversation, and steered it away from anything that might make me look real. I began to notice where she put people. Jocelyn was always near the center of the room, close to the fireplace, close to the photographs, close to whoever mattered. Her husband was asked about work. Her children were called over, and kissed, and admired. When I arrived, my mother took my coat before I had both feet inside, then guided me toward the kitchen or the folding chairs by the hallway, where I could be included without becoming visible. Once, at a Christmas open house, Mrs. Bell from down the street asked. Mara, are you still doing payroll? I opened my mouth, but my mother appeared beside me with a plate of frosted sugar cookies. Yes, something like that, she said. She's good with details. Not everyone is meant for the front of the room. I looked at those little silver-sprinkled stars and thought how much of my life in that family had been covered in the same thin sweetness. So I let her talk. I had clients waiting, tax changes to study, workers depending on Friday checks being right. My real life was growing outside her reach. But silence has a cost. Leave a false story alone long enough, and people stop hearing it as a story. They start calling it truth. While my mother's version of me was settling into other people's minds, Blue Ledger was becoming real in places she never visited. It did not happen all at once. There was no grand opening, no ribbon cutting, no investor check that made the hard parts disappear. It began with a folding table in the back room behind a tax preparer on Fulton Street, and a second-hand printer that jammed every Thursday like it had a personal grudge against payday. My first clients were the kind larger firms ignored because they were too small to flatter anyone's ego. A dental office with 12 employees, a physical therapy clinic with 3 locations and no clean overtime records, and a home health agency whose aides kept calling the front desk because their checks were never the same twice. I understood why that mattered. Payroll looked boring to people who had never waited on a deposit before buying groceries. To me, it was the place where dignity either held or cracked. A person could love their job and still lose faith in it the minute their hours disappeared from a check. Nadine Cho was the first person outside my clients who saw that in me. She ran bookkeeping for small businesses out of an office that smelled like toner and peppermint tea. I met her when one clinic asked her to review my work. I expected suspicion. Nadine gave me 2 hours, 3 questions, and then one sentence I carried for years. People don't notice payroll until it goes wrong, she said. Do it right long enough, and you become invisible. Learn to be powerful while invisible. So I did. 1 client became 4. 4 became 11. I hired a part-time assistant, then a compliance specialist, then someone who knew benefits better than I knew my own birthday. We moved from Fulton Street into a real office with glass doors and a blue sign I pretended not to stare at every morning. 4.5 years before my father's retirement dinner, Blue Ledger won the Northstar Regional Health Services account. I remember the transition file landing in my inbox at 10:42 p.m. Employee records, pay schedules, benefits codes, department transfers, authorization calendars. I opened the roster because that was the work. Then I saw his name. Silas Whitaker, Maintenance Supervisor, Northstar Medical Supply Depot. For a long time, I just sat there. My father had spent years reducing my work to some payroll thing. Now that same work was going to make sure his health benefits stayed active, his overtime was correct, and his Friday check arrived like clockwork. I did not tell my family about Northstar. That is the part people always want to turn into a scheme, as if silence can only mean revenge if it lasts long enough. But the truth is quieter than that. By the time Blue Ledger took over Northstar's payroll and benefits administration, I had already stopped using my family as a place where news belonged. Telling them would have meant opening a door I had spent years learning how to close. So Northstar became work. Complicated work, serious work. The kind of account where one wrong file could delay hundreds of deposits or leave someone's child off a medical plan. We spent the first 3 months cleaning old data, matching job codes, rebuilding deduction tables, and finding mistakes that had been passed from one system to another like family secrets nobody wanted to name. That was when I first met Reed Fallon. He came into the quarterly review with no entourage, no performance, just a gray suit, a yellow legal pad, and the expression of a man who had read enough reports to know when numbers were trying to hide something. He was the COO of Northstar Regional Health Services, which meant people usually softened their voices around him. I did not. There was no room for soft voices in a payroll transition. He asked about missed overtime in the Supply Depot division. I had the answer on page 6. He asked why 2 departments showed duplicate benefit deductions. I had the correction schedule. He asked why one group of night shift workers had received inconsistent shift differentials for 7 pay periods. I told him the old system had classified them under the wrong labor code and that we had already calculated the adjustment batch for Friday. For the first time in years, an older man looked at my work and did not look past it. Reed did not praise me loudly. Men like him rarely did. He just sat back, tapped his pen once against the paper, and said, "You know where the damage is before anyone admits there's damage." I remember answering, "Because by the time payroll breaks, somebody at home has already planned around money that isn't there." He looked at me for a second longer after that. Not sentimental, just attentive. From then on, Reed treated me like the person responsible for the room's oxygen. He called when something mattered. He read my notes. He did not confuse quiet with small. Over the next 4.5 years, we sat across from each other in conference rooms, on video calls, in year-end reviews, and emergency meetings when winter storms closed half the clinics. He knew my face, my signature, my standards, and the name Blue Ledger carried inside Northstar. What he did not know was that one of his maintenance supervisors was my father. And what I did not know was that someday my mother would introduce me to him as if I were nobody at all. The closest I came to mixing those two worlds happened 1 week before the retirement dinner, on a Monday morning when Monica Vale walked into my office carrying a red folder against her chest. Monica was my director of operations, which meant she knew which problems could wait and which ones deserved my door opening without a calendar invite. She had been with Blue Ledger long enough to read my face faster than most people read a dashboard. That morning, she did not sit down right away. She placed the folder on my desk carefully, like something inside it might bruise. "This one needs final approval," she said. I glanced at the tab. Silas Whitaker Retirement Transition Package. For a moment, the office went too quiet. Outside my glass wall, people were moving through an ordinary Monday, phones ringing, printers warming, someone laughing near the coffee station because life has a way of continuing, even when a name on a folder reaches across 14 years and puts its hand around your throat. Monica noticed. Of course she did. "Is this your father?" she asked. I could have lied. I could have said it was just a shared last name, one more file in a system full of people. But Monica had earned more truth from me than my family ever had. "Yes," I said. She pulled the chair back then, slowly, and sat. Inside the folder was everything Northstar had built for a man who had given them 38 years. A $31,000 service bonus, 18 months of bridge health coverage, a consulting offer at $1,400 a month for a year, and the final pension transition documents that needed my sign-off because Blue Ledger administered the process. It was all clean, earned, properly documented. That should have made it easy. It did not. I looked at the numbers and thought about my father at the kitchen table, writing "finish something first" across the bottom of my plan. I thought about every dinner where he had let my mother shrink me and found something fascinating in the carpet instead. I thought about the smallness of his silence, how it had filled whole rooms. Monica said nothing. Good operations people know when a silence is doing work. I had power in that moment. Not dramatic power, not movie power, real power, which is mostly paperwork and timing. I could have slowed the review, asked for clarification, sent it back through channels. No one would have called it revenge. They would have called it process. Instead, I picked up my pen. I signed every line that needed my name. Not because I had forgiven him. Not because I wanted to be the better daughter in some story my mother could retell later. I signed because the package belonged to his 38 years of labor, not to my 14 years of hurt. And I refused to become the kind of person who used a paycheck as a weapon. After I signed my father's retirement package, I closed the folder and sat with my hand resting on top of it for longer than I needed to. Monica watched me from across the desk, not with pity, which I would have hated, but with the steady patience of someone who understood that clean paperwork did not always mean a clean heart. "You're going to the dinner?" she asked. I nodded. My mother's invitation had arrived through Jocelyn, of course, forwarded with 3 lines about dress code, arrival time, and how important it was that Dad's evening stay focused on him. Elaine had not called me herself. That would have required wanting me there in a way she could not perform around. "I'm going," I said. "He worked 38 years. I can show up for that." Monica leaned back, folding her arms. "Reed Fallon will probably be there." "I know. And if he sees you, then he sees me." She studied my face the way she studied broken processes, looking for the point where pressure might split something open. "Mara, he knows you. Not casually. He knows you in rooms where people bring binders and bad news. If your family says something sideways in front of him, he may not understand he's supposed to play along." That almost made me smile. My family has been playing along without him for years. I'm serious. So am I. But after she left, her words stayed with me. I looked through the glass wall at the office I had built, at people moving between desks with coffee mugs and headsets, and problems waiting to be solved. This was the life my family had never bothered to imagine. Not because it was hidden. Because they had decided long ago that nothing worth seeing could grow from me. That evening, I went home and stood in front of my closet, longer than I should have. I chose the gray coat because it was simple and expensive, in a way only people who knew tailoring would notice. Then I took my wallet from my purse and checked, though I already knew, that the folded yellow legal pad was still there. The old paper had softened at the creases. I did not bring it for courage. Courage was too loud a word. I brought it because there are nights when you need to remember exactly what you survived, without turning yourself into it. Before I left, Monica texted once, "Just be careful. Truth has bad timing." I typed back, "Sometimes timing is the only thing truth has." Then I drove north toward Grand Rapids, not planning to expose anyone, not planning to correct anyone, only planning to sit through my father's retirement dinner like a daughter. I did not know my mother was about to make that impossible. By the time I reached the Hawthorne Grand, my mother had already turned my father's retirement into evidence. That was how it felt walking through those doors. Not like a party, not really, but like an exhibit arranged to prove something about the Whitakers. Navy linens on every table. White roses in low glass bowls. A framed photo of my father, in his first Northstar uniform beside the guest book. The banner, over the small stage, read 38 years of service, and underneath it the slideshow kept cycling through pictures of Silas with coworkers, Silas at company picnics, Silas holding safety awards, Silas standing in front of loading bays with the proud, tired smile of a man who had belonged somewhere for most of his life. Elaine belonged to the room even more than he did. She moved through it, like a woman conducting a hymn only she could hear, touching elbows, adjusting centerpieces, sending servers toward the right tables. Her church friends sat close to the stage, where they could see and be seen. Jocelyn and her family were placed at the front, right beside the microphone. My sister wore cream, and her husband wore the harmless smile of a man who knew his role was to nod at the correct moments. My place card was near the swinging kitchen doors. I looked at it, then at the stage, and almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was precise. Elaine had always known exactly where to put me. Close enough to count as family, far enough not to disturb the picture. Jocelyn had a printed speech, folded beside her plate. I saw my mother touch it twice as she passed, like a blessing. No one had asked me if I wanted to say anything about my father's 38 years. That did not surprise me. In my mother's version of the family, Jocelyn spoke on behalf of the daughters, and I was included in the plural only when it served the sentence. I was standing near the coffee station when Artie Klein found me. Artie had worked with my father since before I was born. He had white hair, heavy hands, and the kind of kindness that never announced itself. He looked me over, not measuring, just seeing. "Mara Whitaker," he said. "What are you really doing these days?" I smiled. "Still payroll." He gave a small nod. "Good. People like us survive, because somebody gets payroll right." Before I could answer, the side doors opened, and Reed Fallon walked in wearing a gray suit and the expression of a man who had expected a retirement dinner, not a collision. Elaine saw him instantly. Her face changed, brightened, sharpened. To her, Reed was not a guest, he was an audience. And within seconds, she was moving toward him, pulling Jocelyn first, then turning back to find me. My mother found my wrist before I had time to decide whether to step away. "There you are," she said, bright enough for anyone nearby to believe she was pleased. Her fingers closed gently, but not loosely. Elaine had never needed force. She had spent a lifetime learning how to guide people without leaving marks. "Come with me. Mr. Fallon should meet the family." Jocelyn was already beside her, smoothing the front of her cream dress, the folded speech still in one hand. She gave me a quick look that said, "Please don't make this strange," though I had not done a single strange thing all night. My father noticed us crossing the room and drifted closer from the edge of his old crew, drawn toward Reed by 40 years of workplace instinct. Important men pulled other men into orbit. My mother understood that better than anyone. Reed had set his drink on a high table by the wall. He saw us coming. More importantly, he saw me. For half a second, the room around him seemed to slow. Recognition crossed his face first, then confusion, then the careful stillness of a man realizing two pieces of information did not belong in the same frame. He knew me from conference rooms, year-end reviews, emergency calls, and payroll authorizations. He knew me as the person whose signature moved through Northstar every other Friday. My mother knew none of that. "Mr. Fallon," she said, offering her hand like she was opening a ceremony. "Elaine Whitaker, Silas's wife. We are so honored you came tonight." Reed shook her hand politely. "Silas has given Northstar a great many years. I'm glad to be here." My mother glowed. Praise of my father was praise of her architecture. She turned first to Jocelyn, as she always did. "And this is our Jocelyn," she said, "vice principal at Street Catherine's. Married, 2 children, always the steady one." Jocelyn smiled modestly. A few people nearby leaned in. Betsy Larkin appeared at my mother's shoulder, ready to admire whatever Elaine presented next. Then my mother's hand landed on my shoulder. "Not hard, just enough. And this is Mara," she said, with the little sigh she used when asking a room to forgive me on her behalf. "She's sweet, but she has always been our complicated one. She never really became anything. I think she does payroll paperwork now." The laugh was small. That almost made it worse. My father looked at the carpet. Jocelyn looked into her glass. Betsy made a soft sound of pity. Reed did not laugh. He looked at my mother, then at me. There was a question in his eyes, quiet and professional. I could have saved her. I could have smiled, changed the subject, let Elaine keep the world she had built. Instead, I gave him the smallest nod. Reed set his glass down. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "there's been a serious misunderstanding. Mara Whitaker is the founder and owner of Blue Ledger Workforce Solutions. Her company runs payroll and benefits for Northstar. She signs off on every paycheck in this room." He paused, "Including mine." For a few seconds, no one moved. The sentence did not explode, it spread. It traveled from Reed's mouth into the small circle around us, then outward through the nearby tables, carried by silence before anyone dared repeat it. I watched people turn their heads one by one, first toward Reed, then toward me, then toward my mother, whose hand was still resting on my shoulder, as if she had not yet realized the thing she was holding had become too hot to touch. Elaine's smile stayed in place. That was the strangest part. Her face kept the shape of confidence, but everything behind it had gone blank. "No," she said lightly, as if correcting a child. "I think you mean she works with payroll." Reed's expression did not change. "No, ma'am. Blue Ledger is the payroll and benefits administrator for Northstar Regional Health Services. Mara owns the company. I sit in quarterly reviews with her team. Her approval is on our processing calendar every pay cycle." A sound came from somewhere behind me. Not a laugh this time. More like a breath somebody forgot to hold. Then a younger man near the depot table leaned forward. I recognized him from a winter overtime issue, though I did not know his face well enough to place his name until he spoke. "Blue Ledger?" he said. "That's who fixed our night shift differential last year." Reed nodded once. "Yes." Another woman at the same table looked at me with sudden recognition. "And the benefits transition. When my husband's coverage almost got dropped, that was your office?" "My team handled it," I said. I did not say more. I did not need to. The room was doing the work now. Every corrected check, every benefit card that arrived on time, every Friday deposit people had counted on without knowing whose system held it together, all of it seemed to gather around my mother's little sentence and make it look smaller than it had ever looked before. My father stood very still. He was not looking at Reed anymore. He was looking at me. I could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes, slow and painful. 38 years at Northstar, 4.5 years under Blue Ledger. The retirement papers he had not yet mentioned to anyone. The daughter he had told to finish something first. Elaine finally pulled her hand off my shoulder. "You did this," she said, her voice sharpening. "You planned this to embarrass us." "No, Mom," I said quietly. "I let you tell your story for 14 years. Tonight, you told it to the one person in this room who knew the truth." Her mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. "You didn't get caught by me," I said. "You got caught by what was already true." I left the Hawthorne Grand not long after that. There was no speech, no dramatic exit, no final look back from the doorway. My father's slideshow was still moving across the screen when I picked up my coat. Elaine had sunk into a chair near the front table, surrounded by women who no longer knew where to put their sympathy. Jocelyn stood beside her, pale and silent, holding the speech she never gave. Reed gave me one small nod as I passed him. Artie Klein walked me to the lobby and pressed my hand between both of his. "You did right," he said. "Hard thing, staying clean when people hand you mud." I drove home that night with the radio off. 3 days later, my assistant buzzed my office just after lunch. "There's a Silas Whitaker here," she said carefully. "He says he's your father." I told her to send him in. He walked through the glass doors like a man entering a building where he did not know the rules. He held his cap in both hands. His work jacket was zipped halfway, though the office was warm. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at my desk, the blue sign on the wall, the people moving beyond the glass. Then he said, "I came about my retirement package. Not I'm sorry. Not I should have asked who you became. The package." I nodded toward the chair. He sat on the edge of it. "I figured after the other night," he said, turning the cap in his hands. "After what your mother said, after all of it, you might pull something back. The bonus, the health coverage, the consulting offer. I wouldn't blame you if you did." That was when I understood him more clearly than I ever had. He believed power was something people used to settle pain, maybe because that was the only kind of power he had ever seen up close. "Your package is safe," I said. He looked up. "I signed it before the dinner. The service bonus, the bridge coverage, the pension transition, all of it. You earned those as an employee. I won't use money as a weapon." His face loosened, but relief was not forgiveness, and I did not let him mistake one for the other. "But being my father is not part of that package," I said. "That doesn't come with 38 years of service. That part you still have to earn back." He lowered his eyes. "I don't know if he will. What I know is this. I stopped waiting for the people who dismissed me to approve my worth. I built the system they depended on, signed the checks they never knew passed through my hands, and finally learned that peace is not proving them wrong. Sometimes, peace is letting the truth stand in the room, without begging anyone to recognize it." What Mara's story reminds us is that sometimes the deepest wounds do not come from strangers. They come from the people who were supposed to know us first. A mother's quiet dismissal, a father's silence, a sister's easy place at the center of the room. Those things may not look dramatic from the outside, but they can shape a person for years. Not because they are loud, but because they are repeated until they start to sound like truth. But the story also teaches us something stronger. Your worth does not become real only when your family finally sees it. Mara spent years being reduced to some payroll thing. Her work was minimized because it was not glamorous, not easy to explain, not impressive enough for her mother's social circle. Yet that same quiet work became the system other people depended on. That is how life often works. The thing others mock may be the very thing that builds your future. The skill they overlook may be the one that saves you. The path they call small may become the foundation beneath everyone else's feet. There is also a powerful lesson in restraint. Mara could have used her position to punish her father. She could have touched his retirement, delayed his benefits, or made him feel the same helplessness he once made her feel. But she did not. That choice matters. Healing is not becoming cruel enough to hurt the people who hurt you. Healing is becoming strong enough that you no longer need to. Family should be a place where you are seen before the world applauds you. But when family refuses to see you, that does not mean you disappear. It means you may have to build your life without their permission. And one day, the truth may walk into the room on its own. So, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by the people closest to you? Did you keep explaining, or did you finally stop asking them to understand? If this story touched you, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember this tonight. You do not need the approval of people who only know the smallest version of you.